is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you so much for joining us this week. This week, I'm having another sit-down conversation with my friend, collaborator, and co-founder of this project, Tylor Lovins. Tylor, how's it going, sir?
Great.
Awesome. We are recording tonight on the 6th anniversary of the death of the late, great Christopher Hitchens. He was a huge influence on me, and I just wanted to say that while he's gone, his words, and especially his ideas, will live on. And he was an exceptional voice for reason, and I'm just honored to have, at least at a very minimum, be able to sort of get into his work while he was still alive. So that was one of the real joys. But yeah, he was really, really great.
You see his debate I think it was in London with Fry. It was him and Fry versus like a Catholic bishop.
Yes.
And they took a poll of the crowd beforehand on like undecided if they were in favor of the Catholic Church or not. Mm-hmm. And because of Hitchens, his argument, most of the crowd switched over to...
Yeah. It was him and Fry against an archbishop and I think a conservative Catholic MP.
Yeah. And
Hitch does this like amazing argument about Stephen Fry, and he talks about he's my friend, he's a wonderful person, but you wouldn't accept him because he's a faggot. And like and those are his words, not mine. But that's how he frames it. You have been known historically for homophobia and sexism and bigotry, and not to mention the fact that the institutional cover up of the molestation of young children. So it was, that's a classic debate. I think probably my other favorite debate he ever did was actually one he did towards the end of his life. It was one he did with Tony Blair, which is really good.
Yeah.
And I think he was probably maybe 2010. It was about a year out before he died. And he'd already lost his hair at that point.
Yeah.
But no, that was an exceptionally good debate. And obviously there are ones that are classic, like the ones like with him and William Lane Craig or him and Frank Turek. I think Rabbi Wolpe, there's a really interesting sit down he does with Al Sharpton, which is, it's a very interesting.
I've seen that.
So yeah, his debates are classic. There's an excellent documentary that came out a couple years ago that's called The Hitch. It was made by, I think, like a Swedish or Norwegian filmmaker. And it's kind of a biography documentary that compiles a lot of clips of him sort of telling his own life story.
Huh.
And then using sort of debates. It's an excellent documentary. It may still be on YouTube. I think it's available on Vimeo. I would definitely, if you're somebody new to atheism or you're new to this sort of space and you want to learn about Christopher Hitchens, I highly recommend you check that out for sure. Mm-hmm. So let's get into it. So we've got a lot of topics we want to cover tonight. We'll try to hit it as much as we can. But let's first kind of talk a little bit about, you've been taking this course on the Reformation.
Yeah.
And you've been working out some of those ideas. And I'd love to hear your experience taking that course and sort of where you think, tentatively at least, where this may apply to secularists, atheists.
Yeah. So I've been taking this, I think it's called The History of the Reformation Now and Then, or Then and Now. Mm-hmm. And we focused on reading specifically things on Martin Luther, sort of the effects that the Protestant protest of the Catholic Church sort of enacted throughout history. There's a theory that it's responsible in large part for the secularism because it questioned like the central authority of the Catholic Church, but also the marrying church and government. Mm-hmm. So we focused a lot on the historical aspect, but towards the last 2 or 3 weeks, we brought in some modern thinkers that are sort of taking up the Reformation banner in some ways.
Yeah.
One of them is decolonizing Lutheranism, and it was a movement that kind of started on Twitter, but they go around and try to talk about intersectionality with traditional Lutheran congregations and sort of dismantling the housing of theology and culture. So that's kind of interesting. One thing I've been thinking about throughout most of the course was, what are the conditions of theological truth claims? So it's pretty easy for me to, probably for anyone, in the modern world to come up with the truth conditions of a scientific statement correspondence to reality, right?
Mm-hmm. Correspondence to evidence, yeah.
What's the evidence? And so the evidence is out there in the public world, and where 2 or 3 gather, they can see it, right?
Yeah.
So the question of the truth conditions of a theological statement seemed to me throughout the course sort of ambiguous and esoteric in some ways. For instance, you could give a descriptive answer in terms of it being housed within institutional ties,
mm-hmm.
right? So if you're a member of a certain congregation, then having a certain experience or meeting certain criteria, you would recognize the truth of a theological statement.
Okay, that's interesting.
So on one side, the descriptive end, and you can sort of do psychology. You can do scientific work and sort of uncover those conditions for people. You could do like a phenomenology of how truth appears to someone,
mm-hmm.
something like that. So that part wasn't terribly interesting to me because I think there's a distinction between how does truth appear to people and what makes it true. For instance, the descriptive aspect you can do on scientific truth claims. And so you can say, for instance, what kind of advertising techniques can we implement so that people can see that this is true, right?
Yeah.
On global warming or something.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's one end of the spectrum. But the other end that I was really interested in is what makes it true. And we've already answered this for scientific statements.
Mm-hmm.
So one place to start in connection with this, one place I started, was trying to think about the import of theological language for Christians. So, for instance, we can imagine a community that uses the word love to mean the pleasure or an experience of pleasure, right? A second community would use love and mean good works in service of the neighbor. So they both use the word love, but for the second community, it seems to be more encompassing. It seems to not only bring in the sense of pleasure, because doing good works can be pleasurable at sometimes, but also expand outward into the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the first one, where love only means the experience of pleasure, it's sort of an inward emotional event in some ways. And so, for instance, if service to neighbor is displeasurable, it's not a possibility in love, for love in my world, right? So in some ways, concepts give us possibilities. So the possibilities for love in community 1 is different from community 2, but they also give meaning to action. So for instance, if 2 people are losing weight, they can have the exact same schedule, the exact same eating habits, the exact same diet, maybe even the exact same life. But when you ask them, and one person says, I'm losing weight because in 2 weeks I'm going to the beach and I want to look good, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get an idea that this person's living in a certain world. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
That certain things are valuable, other things aren't. If you ask the other person, why are you losing weight? And they say, well, my doctor says if I don't, then the worst consequences of diabetes will follow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they have the same exact actions, but completely different meaning because of the concepts that they use in connection.
So I love what you're saying here, because this is definitely going to tie into our later part of our evening tonight when we discuss free will.
Yeah.
Because right. I think you've hit on something that's really interesting, that Daniel Dennett in his book Elbow Room, which I've been reading through, and I very much identify with Dennett's position. He talks about the possibility of deliberation and the certain level of control. So
yeah, that's great.
So for example,
yeah.
Let's say, like your example of the 2 people, let's say they're eating exactly the same, they're doing the exact exercise routine, they're hitting the same targets, they're hitting the same goals, but they're doing it for 2 completely different reasons. Now, a determinist would say something along the lines of like, well, it doesn't really matter what the end result is. All that matters is the fact that they got to it, and the reason they got to that is clearly just part of the puppetry of life, or the puppetry of existence. Whereas the compatibilists would say something along the lines of like, well, of course, there's going to have a certain level of like determined outcomes based on what you're going to do. But on top of the actual end and the means, there's also there's the end, there's the means, and then there's the goal. And the goal is different depending on how you look at it. So and that's where we get into the concept of deliberation and then the further concept of degrees of freedom. Mm-hmm. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But I wanted to because what you've said to me I think is very interesting. It's this idea of revert, kind of what Dennett talks about with the concept of the intentional stance.
Yeah.
So you can almost say something along the lines of it like there's the implicit stance and the external stance, or the explicit stance. The implicit's the one where you're talking about love being pleasure. The explicit one's about love being about connection to, say, community or a certain level of charity, things like that.
So let's keep that in mind.
Yeah. We'll come back to that. I didn't want to derail you, but I loved the point you were making. Because it's very close to kind of some of the concepts I've been reading in Elborum.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about how language, for instance, gives meaning to action and also gives possibilities for action. And depending on what your words mean, that sort of determines what your future looks like. So I call that your linguistic situation. So we have a linguistic situation, and our question is, how is it that theological statements are made true? What makes them true? Mm-hmm. Not just the descriptive, how does truth finally appear to someone as true? Mm-hmm. Right. So for science, it's correspondence to reality, and I think this is, the realm theology thinks is the truth conditions of a theological statement is its correspondence to the human situation. And the human situation is that we are beings that use language. And the language we use either grants us freedom or constrains us. So, for instance, in connection with this, I read a book for that course recently called The Cross and the Lynching Tree by a black theologian named James Cone. And lynching went on, the timeline he gives is from 1870 to 1940, but it goes on, if you go beyond to 1950. But one of the points he makes is that no white theologians wrote about lynching, but over 5,000 occurred in that time period.
That's very interesting.
And black people are Christians, right, in the South. They go to black churches. But white theologians didn't see the necessity to sort of speak out against lynching. So in connection with this, we can talk about, for instance, how for evangelicals, the issue, they're like one-issue voters in some ways with abortion. So they have tied the notion of sin with morality. So what I want to do in this conceptualization of the truth conditions of theological statements is to say, actually, the Christian notion of sin is not a moral notion. It's an epistemological. So I think this will become intelligible here in a second.
Right on.
So what happens for instance, when somebody hears the word of God, is that their entire situation has changed. When they hear a theological claim as true, what occurs is that they're called into question as to what their future looks like. Are you going to make the word of God true? Right? So there's this notion in Christianity that faith is obedience, and in obedience you get freedom. So with, for instance, white theology tying sin with morality, you don't get this notion that actually for theology God breaks in to your linguistic situation and it's turned upside down, and what you thought moral before isn't moral, really. The importance of this is that the truth conditions of a theological statement are true to the extent that Christians make them true. We are godless in the sense that we live in the world and our linguistic situations that were handed down to us from history, by tradition, things like that. And we have faith only to the extent that despite our notions of morality, of truth, and of the future, we remain open to an inbreaking that turns it all upside down. That says, yeah, that was your morality in the past, for instance, that you have to vote for a politician that is pro-life. So that's what your entire faith hinged on before. But the inbreaking of the gospel for theology, I think, is to say, actually, God is nothing like humans. And functionally, when you hear the word of God, your situation changes as you live it out, as you make it true.
And so what is the word of God in that context?
Yeah. So speaking as a godless person, the word of God in that context is the question. This is sort of cliche, but it's the question to all the answers that you have.
Okay.
It's this notion that Jordan Peterson puts it this way: what is true for me in the present might not be true enough in the future to enable me to live and thrive.
Okay.
So when I hear the word of God, for instance, it's this notion that nothing is God. Nothing that we can point to or say is God. So that we're always seeking, always listening for a word in our linguistic situation that grants freedom for a new future.
Okay.
So one of the ways to frame this is to say we're godless in two ways. One, there's no clear idea of what we mean when we say God.
I agree with that.
Yeah, that's for Christians and atheists alike. And two, there are no clear possibilities that will lead us to a future that isn't one in which all of humanity is just wiped out. So we got the nuclear tensions between North Korea, Trump. We have global warming. Mm-hmm. So we have our present crises, but also those that were handed down to us from the linguistic situations of the past.
And the thing that's interesting about the nature of what you're describing with is and hopefully I'm grasping kind of what you're trying to get at, but the way I would frame it, I guess in more secular language would be that in some respects truth is provisional. That what we know about reality is provisional, in the sense that, and this is an insight I think that, particularly the John Dewey had a really key insight about, because Dewey started as sort of Hegelian in the Jamesian tradition and diverted, and his key insight was that, and what I think makes pragmatism both appealing in a both a sort of conceptual sense and both in an actionable sense, is the idea that by using a sort of scientific method, you are constantly improving the knowledge you have, which then informs the actions that you take. So, for example, what we know today about the science of, or the quote unquote science of race. Mm-hmm. If you look a century ago, you see the rise of a pseudoscientific movement of eugenics, which essentially argued that there were certain biological quote-unquote races, and that these races were some were higher on a hierarchy than others. And what the sort of the 20th century revolution of biology, particularly in the mid to the later half of the 20th century, sort of turns all those notions on its head and says, no, this is wildly wrong. Human beings, by and large, are almost genetically the same. Like by 99.9997. Mm-hmm. The minor differences that happen that are biological are not something that you can sort of put a value judgment on. So the problem, I think, that the sort of the racist pseudoscience of eugenics and then that kind of thing was it committed a fundamental central error that it didn't see it was doing, which is the naturalistic fallacy.
Right. Yeah.
And so once we learned that, we improved our lot. Mm-hmm. And we didn't know that the future was going to be
right.
like that.
Yes.
We had to get there. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's the idea of truth being provisional. I also like what you mentioned about the idea of the concept of God being so amorphous. It's why I'm an atheist. I think that the reason that I'm an atheist is it's a lack of belief based on a lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
And the reason there's a lack of knowledge is because, in my opinion, no one has presented to me a consistent, coherent version of God that is consistent with what we know about reality. In that sort of tangible sense. Mm-hmm. It's not metaphorical, right? And so my overall point is that I like the idea of, it's not that truth is unattainable, because I don't think it's unattainable. It's that truth is provisional. That it's based upon the information we have at the time. We change our minds based on the better evidence that we have, which then in turn changes our actions. But we may not know what those actions are until we get to them.
So maybe a different avenue in which to sort of talk about this question of the provisionality of truth is that makes sense when we're talking about information and facts. But what about ethics, for instance, right? So fundamentally, for instance, we could say it's immoral to kill a person for no reason, right? What does the provisionality of truth mean in that instance?
That's true. So I guess the way in which I think we kind of change this is that it's conceptually, it's very hard, I think, to say, oh, it's just like this. But I think if you look at it in I guess not to beat a dead horse, but pragmatically, I think one of the things that you consist of is that there are sort of universal values that we can try to attain. Some of them are shared by many cultures, regardless of where the sort of the cultural underpinnings come from.
Yeah.
So if you look at particular prescriptions against murder, I mean, they date back far beyond the Bible, some of that are codified. But then even with the Ten Commandments itself, and I think I'm slightly going on a tangent, but I'll come back, is if you look at the phrase, thou shalt not kill, that's not a universal statement. It's in the context of talking about you shall not kill those who are like us.
Right.
There's the subtext there that a lot of people don't get.
Yeah.
About
it's about society building in that instance.
Exactly. So it's like thou shalt not kill. What that really means is thou shalt not kill these types of people who are part of God's chosen people. Right. The rest of them, who gives a shit?
Yeah.
And so, I guess the idea of truth being provisional is that as we learn more about the world, either it's scientifically or whatever, the more that we learn about the world, I think the better we can be at making decisions. And this is something that Sam Harris has talked about, I think, very well and very eloquently in my favorite book of his, The Moral Landscape. I mean, he makes a point about the classic notion of the is-ought problem and how you can't derive an ought from an is, the classic David Hume thing. And Harris's whole point is that, yeah, you can't directly derive an ought from an is, but the is inform your oughts. That what you learn about the world informs the kind of decisions that you make. And so what I would say about truth being provisional is, as we get better information about the world, it allows us to make better decisions, which in turn allows us to be more ethical. So I think of it as being sort of a constantly evolving process.
So in light of the is-ought problem, for instance, we can return to the notion, which I think everyone I know would agree with, it's immoral to kill an innocent person for no reason. There's a sense in which no matter what kind of information we gain, that will never change.
Yeah, that's true.
So I guess what I'm trying to point to is Nietzsche sort of makes this distinction between the instincts and then like beliefs or something.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I think on the one end, the ethical portion is true because we make it true. Like in our relations and the conditioning factors we set up in terms of social sanctions and law and things like that, right? Whereas the information part, that's true because it corresponds to reality. The ethical part is true because by the choices we make it true, right? Immorality. We have sort of a base notion of what's immoral and moral. And by that, we sort of make extrapolations to specific situations. But I think one is more instinctual where the other is more conceptual. Totally.
And I've written about this before. And in the essay that we posted on the site, the Promise of Secular Humanism, I make a key distinction between what I call the moral instinct and the moral framework. And I think there's a tremendous amount about us that is morally instinctual. And I think a lot of it is built into us. It's a product of evolution. Whether it's reciprocal altruism, kin selection, those concepts permeate what we do. Because one of the things I think that we often do is we discount the importance of instinct, and we discount the importance of sort of emotions. Because I think the power of an instinct and a power of an emotion can actually be deeply rational. So, like, for example, I give the example in my essay that Dan Berker gives in his book, Life-Driven Purpose, about being in an airport and he sees a small infant on top of a piece of luggage. And the baby starts to fall, and he sees it starting to fall. And without any thinking or deliberation, he just grabs the kid. That's hardwired into us. There's no reason to do that, right? But there's no reason to deliberate about it. You just do it because that's built into us.
I think you can go wider with that as well. For instance, the bus boycott is motivated by instinctually by a fight against lifelessness, against oppression, things like that.
I think it's also an innate sense of justice, which is also, I think, something that's central to our instinctual framework.
So in that distinction between the instinct and the conceptual framework, I think religious language and people who are religious, who are so for religious reasons and not political or philosophical, are sort of trying to honor the instinct over the conceptual.
Okay.
They don't see for instance, the scientific framing of knowledge, an adequate honoring of that which gives the will to life, justice, the good, things like that. And so I think in Christian theology, for instance, you get this notion that the instinctual drive is there for the good, but our framework of what is good is godless. So that there's always a possibility that what we think is good is actually not good. And sort of waiting on a word from God, our whole system could be blown up. For instance, that white theologians might recognize that lynching is wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, or the very complex theological debates regarding slavery in the United States. The fact that it wasn't just a universal, that and part of that is theological. I mean, if you read something like Alexander Stephens, who is the vice president of the Confederacy, but he has something called the Cornerstone Speech, which he gives in 1861, and explicitly says that we have founded the Confederacy in the notion that our God-given right to subjugate black people. Yeah. And so you have this, in the United States, you have, I think, powerful and amazing and eloquent people making the religious argument against slavery. If you look at somebody like William Lloyd Garrison. And then on the other end of it, you have these pamphleteers who are arguing a sort of biblical tradition of slavery. And in their defense, I mean, they don't need a defense, but in their I guess, if you look at Bible, and if you look at something like Exodus 21, it talks about very, very specific notions of how you treat slaves. So, but then there are other passages which, and there's, I think, other notions of Jesus talking about freeing people. So it's, the text itself is vague. Right. And it allows itself to sort of be splintered depending upon whatever we humans want to do, right? And that's always been the problem I've always had with religion at a certain level, is that, particularly with Christianity, is that it's this grab bag of concepts where it's, and there are times where it's just flat out contradictory with itself. Right. And how do we reconcile that in a way that we can be moral? Because honestly, like, people who are more inclined to the way I kind of look at it, which is just to scrap it. And to do something better, to pull from religion what is good and to just jettison the rest. But I know that that's not easy for people. So how do we reconcile these things? How can we reconcile some of the hard truths about monotheistic religion, particularly like Christianity and Islam, with our modern notions of how we want to build an ethical society?
Yeah. So one distinction that the Reformers made was the difference between the spirit and the text, or the letter, the spirit and the letter. Okay. So there's a difference between what the Bible says, what specific historical situations. It's speaking to what the specific purpose of any given passage is within its time in history, and what the Bible testifies to. So I think in my notion of theological, the conditions of theological truth claim, what the Bible testifies to is this mystery where just by meditating, working within certain frameworks and living in the world, all of a sudden our moral conceptual framework can be flipped upside down. And hermeneutical innovation can occur within that. So I think language about God tries to honor that event and experience that I think is basic to human experience of the world. Just that I don't think there's, I can give the most logical argument against, for instance, the election of Roy Moore.
Yeah. Senate candidate, yeah.
And there's a sense in which a person, upon hearing that, doesn't care, right?
Nope.
So, and this is Aristotle's distinction between rhetoric and dialectic.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a way that we have to be open, sort of instinctually, emotionally, to receive a new kind of truth about the world.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, Carl Sagan has this point that he talks about, and I think I made it into a meme for the site, but something about how we need both imagination and skepticism. That we need a certain level of commitment to facts and a commitment to evidence and a commitment to rigorous investigation of claims. But at the other end, we do need to have a sense of openness about something that's new, that revolutions do occur in terms of ideas, and that we have to have a certain level of openness.
Yeah.
It also goes back to the classic notion of, in a more of a folk sense, the aphorism of you want to have an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think this is the thing I like about what you're describing is it's a theology which I think is comfortable with doubt, and it's comfortable with ambiguity, because I think the world is ambiguous. Yeah. I think there are certain things about the world that are pretty definite, like, right. I know that I live in a particular city. I know that this is my job. I know, that 2 and 2 make 4. I know that, to my eternal chagrin, that Donald Trump is president. There's just certain things that we know as demonstrable facts, right? But then we can talk about the broader things about larger concepts like ethical concepts, and talk about what does it mean to love? What does it mean to be beautiful? What does it mean to be righteous or to have justice? What is justice? What kind of justice would we seek? Those are questions that are eternal in some respects.
Yeah.
And as you said, some kind of new information can turn that completely upside down. And that's when you have, what I call sort of moral revolutions, where we radically change. And this is something that Steven Pinker really hints at in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where you see this revolution in ideas that start really in a lot of ways with the Reformation, that go into the age of the Enlightenment. And that the Enlightenment notion of individual rights and self-proprietorship, the notion of private property was a revolution in and of itself. That these are paradigm shifting. They completely changed the world. And so I think that's, for me at least, that's what skepticism is about, is the idea that you keep an open mind. You listen to new ideas. You don't just dismiss them outright simply by virtue of they don't fit into your paradigm. You take the time to investigate. Because if you don't, then you end up becoming what Peter Boghossian calls doxastically closed, that you're not open to experience. You're not open to new evidence. You're not open to new ideas. And you can become somebody like, let's say, like a Roy Moore voter, who is so committed to a particular version of Christianity that they are unwilling to see. They can see, there's certain things to them that are immoral that they can see outright, right? Mm-hmm. For example, the guy who won, Doug Jones, is a pro-choice candidate. The fact that a pro-choice candidate won in Alabama is fucking mind-boggling and fantastic because we need more pro-choice candidates. But that's a different discussion. Anyway, and this was something I think I mentioned to you last night, and I'll bring it up here, is I think that some people have a certain level of religious commitment that they cannot see what truly a moral decision they're making in terms of a moral calculation. So like they're going to vote for Roy Moore. And the reason they're going to vote for Roy Moore is, and I'm trying to remember how I phrased it to you, the sins of Roy Moore, particularly the fact that he's allegedly been accused of improper conduct with women, particularly young girls and children, that he is sort of a pederast, that those sins are sort of finite. They're done. They happened.
They're in the past.
They're in the past. Yeah. They're done. Christ has washed him of his sins. Mm-hmm. It's over. Whereas with Doug Jones being pro-choice, that is a perpetual sin in their eyes. That is somebody who is aiding and abetting a perpetual sin of destroying life. Mm-hmm. And that's how they look at it. Do I think that Roy Moore voters, the average Roy Moore voter, thinks about this in the same way that I do? No. But I do think that what I'm saying is instinctual to them. That it's because it's baked into their theology as such, or their view of the world. So when they go in and they go into the ballot box and they pick who they want to go with, they literally are saying, am I comfortable with the finite sins, or am I comfortable with the infinite ones? Right. And that is something that I think atheists dismiss, and not all atheists. I don't even think it's atheists. I would say liberals too. People who tend to be pro-choice or people who tend to be secular in general. Yeah, and that includes a lot of religious people. That they don't understand. That the thought of a person, and for us, like on the outside of it, we look at this and we go, so you're more comfortable with voting for essentially an alleged pedophile than for somebody who supports a woman's right to choose. That's your moral matrix. Mm-hmm. And that is why I think I am a critic of religion. This is why I speak out against religion in a lot of ways, because it's this kind of stuff that leads to a country where an alleged child molester could almost win a U.S. Senate seat and nobody give a shit. Because the Senate will say, McConnell and all those guys said, oh yeah, we won't seat him. Bullshit. If Roy Moore was elected, not only would they have sat him as a U.S. Senator, they would do it like that. Yeah. They wouldn't even think about it. Whereas they're dragging their feet on getting Jones into the Senate. They're probably not going to get him until January. And that's what people hate about politicians, is that sense of hypocrisy. But is it hypocrisy if you're so deluded to think that you're right? And that's really my question. It's hypocrisy to us, but is it hypocrisy to somebody like Mitch McConnell? I don't know.
So I think what you're describing there in terms of the delusion and the inability to see the practical outcomes of that decision and how it would seem to contradict the moral matrix, for instance, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, is nothing unique to religion.
No.
In terms of the eugenics movement.
Absolutely not. You're right.
Incorporating science, essentially. And just one thing I think is important to point out in terms of the exit polls, the 97% of black women and 93% of black males who voted for Doug and not Moore, whereas the majority of white women and white males voted for Moore. Right. Mm-hmm. So there's also, and
I bet you
there's a marrying.
If you ask 9 out of those 10 voters, all of them are Christians.
Oh yeah, there's something like over 80%, I think, of evangelicals voted for Moore. Mm-hmm. So there's a certain,
which is consistent because 81% of them voted for Trump.
Yeah, right. So there's a marrying of a cultural lifestyle and ideology with the religious belief that I think there's a question of whether that undermines the religious element itself, and it's just an empty ideology.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we could say that's because of religion. I think it's because there's a confluence of those two things that really makes something newly life-destroying.
Yeah. Well, and this goes back, I think, to what you and I have talked about before, which is the idea that religion has, I think, two central components. I mean, and you can kind of quibble on some of the minor details, but I think religion in general has really two components to it. It has the text, and it has the subtext. And I think as atheists, we often overemphasize the text. We for good reason. There's a lot of shit that's wrong and barbaric and bad about religion, and particularly monotheistic religion. It's written in a time where people thought that, sea monsters were a legitimate hazard. And if you spat on a wound, then you'd be all right. That would heal it. But there's also subtext. And what I mean by that is that there are cultural traditions. And there's parts of religion that are not explicitly tied to the text, but that evolved over time.
Right. These
are the kinds of things that atheists discount because their whole thinking, I think, and not all atheists, I think it's critics of religion often don't understand the dynamic between the subtext and the text. And so I think one of the things I'm interested in is how can we reform how we view the text so that the subtext isn't so bad, in the sense that, like, for example, with people in Alabama, you have the majority of Christian white people voting for Moore, the majority of black Christian people voting for Doug Jones, which hints at your earlier example about how, we have, these decades of lynching.
Yeah.
And you have white theologians saying nothing.
Yeah.
That speaks volumes about the cultural, that speaks volumes about the subtext. That there are a lot of people who tie Christianity explicitly to white supremacy.
Right.
And there are people who do it in a more racist and open way, people like David Duke. And then there are people who do it more implicitly, which are the people who voted for Roy Moore. They will never come out and say that that's what it is.
Right.
But it is. Mm-hmm. And this talks about, this is what we talk about with, institutional racism. Well, there's also institutional supremacy, and this is a component to it. And that is, and again, that's something that is not unique to religion, but it is a part of it, and it's something that we have to reckon with if we're trying to make a better society.
Oh yeah. So what I talk about with religion, I'm less interested, even though I'm not saying this is unimportant, with the social dynamics in terms of what parts of religion, when people come together, are sort of built up just by the very fact of the sociology of people and like what happens to any institution, right? I'm more interested in what leaders of religion in the past and present are sort of testifying to when they talk religiously or when they pray or something like that. That's sort of what I'm trying to talk about more so. Because I think those are the things that are essential to religion. And if we're going to talk about if there's a future without religion, what that means, or even a future with religion, what would that mean? I think that sort of space is what we have to reckon with in terms of if the great leaders of Christianity, if in their language they're honoring and testifying to something we can't otherwise honor and testify to, maybe there's something to that. And that's what I try to wrestle with and think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of, as a historian, I mean, there are a lot of ways in which there have been in this country ways in which leaders have used religious language to, I think, defend deeply, I think, beautiful and humanistic ideas. I think of, Lincoln's second inaugural, where he talks about, both sides, meaning both sides in the Civil War, both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God. Both sides pretend to know. Both sides pretend that they know what God's purposes is, but we do not know God's purposes. Mm-hmm. That hints at a fundamental notion that I think is really important about where Lincoln was trying. He was trying to use his understanding of religion and theology. Because I do think on some level he was sort of a free-thinking Unitarian. He wasn't explicitly a Christian, but he was not an atheist. But Lincoln was hitting on something deeper about the United States has basically two worlds within it, and both of them adhere to what they think of as their concept of God, and both of them sternly defend what they're doing in God's name. And then he just flat out says, well, we don't know what he wants.
Yeah.
That's ballsy. I mean, this, and again, that's, you know, this is Lincoln. This is during the Civil War. This is, you know, when you have something like, you know, Battle Hymn of the Republic, you know, his truth is marching on, where, you know, Lincoln is explicitly saying there, but is it? You know, is his truth really marching on? Do we really get it? That is radical in a way that I don't know if any American president before or after ever really hinted at. I mean, he's actively trying to wrestle with the sort of broader theological concepts, and he's doing it in such a way that is compelling for us to understand the context of the Civil War. Where he's talking about both sides argued that they are God's chosen people, that we are doing what God wants. But I think it's hubris to think that we know what God wants. That speaks volumes about how Lincoln was looking at that at the time. It's why it's my favorite speech of his. It's amazing. I mean, it's a speech that you can read in like 5 minutes, but it's one of those things where it's a speech where he's really wrestling with what it means to not just be a person who believes in God and sort of that concept or whatever, or what does it mean to be a God fearing person or whatever, but he's also wrestling with what does it mean to be an American. And that is something that he wrestles with in his connections to understanding. You know, he uses theology as a means to explore the future of what could be an American identity, and that is in and of itself, I think, a certain level of genius. That's why people love Lincoln. It's not just because he freed the slaves, although he did do that. It's not because he preserved the Union, although he did that. It's because he did it with a force of moral determination and that he himself was imperfect. He evolved on it over time, but this reconceptualization of our relationship with our own theology as a culture is uniquely tied to how we're going to then view ourselves in the future,
right?
Which he then makes a point of in the classic phrase from that speech, which is with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God lets us see the right. So he's talking, I mean, it's this, you know, it's this idea that we need to have humility. Yeah. Our country has been through 4 years of ravaged war. We have torn our country apart. And at this time of intense tragedy, of human toil and suffering, we need to seriously reconsider what it means to be an American and considerably reconsider what we think about as we go forward as a country. And had he lived, that was something he was going to reckon with. The other person who does this really well is Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King does exactly the same thing that Lincoln is doing with theology. And this is why I don't dismiss it, because to understand America is to understand Christianity. You have to. It's whether you're atheist or not, like, you have to understand the cultural importance of religion, and particularly Christianity in this country, because by doing that you can then understand the future of what we seek to be. And that's what Lincoln did. That's also what Martin Luther King did, where he's talking about in Letter to a Birmingham Jail, where he's talking about this idea that there's man's law and then there's the universal law, you know. And, you know, and he makes a point of, like, it either comes from God or not, but it's universal. And that when the natural law, when what is supposed to be the universal law, universal right, is infringed upon so much by what we do, it is morally defensible to resist it nonviolently. That it is not just necessary, it's not just sufficient, but it's necessary to do so. This is why it's so important to understand that, because by understanding that theology, you do understand American identity. And to me, that's what's very important about it. So that's the project of understanding the complexities of religious ideas help us to unpack what we seek to do with the future. And you need that. I mean, you need that.
But I just wanted to sort of give a summary of what I was trying to get to earlier.
Of course. In
that notion of truth conditions of theological statements. So I think with the major thinkers within Christianity and those who employed the language of God, you have to stand responsible in your existence for the truth of the claim. So that's why martyrdom is so central to religion, because in your obedience to what you think is God's word, you're saying this is the truth, and this is why I stake my life on. So in the sort of institutionalization of religion, you lose that in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. You have this notion of intellectual assent to doctrine, right? And so actually what happens is people in their sort of indoctrination become mindless in a lot of ways. And I think that works against the essence of Christianity and religion. Within that notion of responsibility, in my linguistic situation, being able to respond with words for what I'm doing. I think what's central to Christianity also is this notion of idolatry. God can't be found anywhere, neither in our logical conclusions, in the events of the world, the history of the world, except where, for Christianity, where God shows God's self as the Savior. As, in this sense, the resurrected Christ means my life is no longer lived in the interests created between birth and death, but in a life with interests beyond death. So Martin Luther King Jr., for instance, was very aware of the fact that at any speech he could be killed, but his interests were set beyond death.
Yep. Right?
In terms of the legacy of the civil rights movement, what it could do to black people as a whole. I think that's what's meant with the language of resurrection in a mythological way in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. That you're born again, you've died to sin, so you've died to our godless situation where we think we can have answers to everything. And because you're sort of created, you're a new creation, you can start thinking now without death on my mind, for instance. I can start thinking of, for instance, natural law. Yeah. This is good, despite the fact that I'm going to die because I'm doing it. Yeah. And because I'm advocating for it.
Yeah. That's I think the thing that's important is a sense of permanence that is achieved through a certain level of openness. I mean, with King, he gives this speech the night before he's killed. And it's a speech he gave many times before, a portion of a sermon he gave many, many times, but this version is particularly beloved by people, where he talks about, I've made it to the mountain and I've seen the promised land. Yeah. And I may not make it there with you. Yeah. But I have seen the promised land. And that's what he's saying there in a biblical sense is, of course, I'm seeing the promised land. But on some level, it's also that social gospel tradition of, I see what is possible in America. Right. And I may not get there with you on that journey to achieve what we want in America, with truth and justice and equality and and equal representation and social justice and economic justice. I may not make it with you, but that does not mean that my message, that what I seek to do, is undermined by that. Yep. That is to me, that's a deeply humanistic message. Yeah. Because it says, I don't care about my death. Mm-hmm. I don't care about that. It's irrelevant because I know it's happening anyway. What matters is what I seek to do, which will help others get to that promised land. That's what I take away from, particularly in American history, where I take away the importance of theology and understanding theology. You have to like I said earlier, to understand America, you have to understand Christianity. Whether you like it is irrelevant. Whether you believe it is irrelevant, and I don't believe it. But there's a message there that is transcendent.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what's very important.
Mm-hmm.
So let's change gears a little bit, and let's talk about free will. So we've been meaning to have this conversation for a while. I will preface this with just a brief comment. So one of, I think, the most provocative books that's come out in the last few years about this subject is Free Will by Sam Harris. I am a fan of Sam Harris. I don't always agree with him on everything, but I like Sam Harris a lot. And I think that by far and away, his best book is The Moral Landscape. I think it's his most cogent book. I think it's his most articulate. I think it's his most consistent book. Thoroughly researched. I just think it's the strongest work he's ever put out to date. But conversely, I think that Free Will as a book is his weakest book, and I think it's often where The Moral Landscape is very sort of cogent and consistent and explicit. Free Will tends to be sort of slapshod and vague and sort of rudderless in what it's trying to achieve. In my estimation, and what prompted this was a few years ago when the book came out, Daniel Dennett, the philosopher Daniel Dennett, wrote a long reply to Harris, which I read. I read Free Will and then I read the reply. And the essential point that Dennett makes is that what you're doing is you're taking our folk understanding of free will and you're tearing that down. And Dennett's point is, I agree with you on that. That the notion of the free will that people think they have is probably not true. That's probably an illusion. But there is a free will worth wanting, as he phrases it. And that is moral responsibility. And that there is certain degrees of freedom that we do actually have that are not tied to a classical notion of free will. And the problem that I think I have is that I find that the message of free will, the book by Sam Harris, I think in some respects actually does a disservice to his book, The Moral Landscape. Because, he talks all the time about intentionality and agency. Well, if we just live in a fully deterministic world where the self is an illusion, then intention and they don't matter. None of those matter. So I guess my first question to you on this subject is, because you had mentioned something about how you really think that with those two books that Harris is kind of reconceptualizing morality. Am I right to think that on some level I find the books one sort of undermines the other, or are they complementary to one another?
Well, maybe both and, depending on what perspective you take. I think what's happening in the debate between Dennett and Harris is something similar to what's happening between the debates on science and religion, in the sense that one has a certain conception of the world in which the human experience of reality is central, and the other has a conception of the world where there are facts about the world that don't need humans, right? So I think free will developed in this situation where human relations are what is essential to the concept of free will, whereas Harris wants to retrospectively redefine free will and say, no, it has to do with cosmology and about cause and effect relationships. For instance, I think he might say this in the book, The Moral Landscape, but I know he says this in one of his interviews, that values, the notion of values, like moral values, are facts of human consciousness, right? But that doesn't tell us what is morally relevant. Whereas real values do tell us what is morally relevant, right? So I think this sort of also goes back to the notion of linguistic situation. The kind of linguistic framework we impose on a situation we find ourselves in will sort of provide possibilities for not only thought, but action and the meaning of those thoughts and actions. So in one way, if we take the traditional notions of agency and intentionality, his book on free will does undermine his Moral Landscape book. But on the other hand, if we understand the project to be sort of coherent, then we can say Harris is actually imposing a new kind of framework or a different kind of framework on moral problems, traditional moral problems.
Yeah, I think that's true. One way I think we can think about it, and this is something I think I mentioned to you before, but it's something I think, for all of his talk of intentions, I think what Harris is trying to do is reframe moral understandings within his conception of moving the framing of the discussion from agents to actions. So agents are sort of interchangeable, they do whatever. Actions are kind of the universal. And in that regard, I do think that the books can be compatible. Where I don't think they're compatible is in the sense that I think that when you say things like, I don't know, I find his Free Will, for me as a book, I find it's just kind of, lazy is not the right word. It's kind of,
not rigorous.
It's not rigorous in the way that particularly the moral landscape is. And what I think I have a huge problem with is this idea that he sort of sets up a straw man concept of free will and then tears that down. Mm-hmm. And Dennett sort of makes that point, but then Harris sort of fights back with, yes, I know that I'm doing that. And the reason I'm doing that is because the majority of people think that they have what you would say is a straw man. That's what there are a lot of people who genuinely think that they have like perfect indeterministic free will. So in a lot of ways, I think Dennett and Harris are talking past each other. Mm-hmm. And you kind of noted that earlier about how there's a determinism, which is, that cause and effect. It's based in physics. This goes back to Laplace. I have no problem with any of that.
Yeah.
Not at all. And neither does Dennett. Dennett goes, yeah, this is totally true. But that does not negate the importance of sort of human agency and particularly the capacity for control and moral judgment.
Another way to say this, I think, is that we're no longer trying to describe reality when we're talking about free will. Mm-hmm. We're talking about the meaning of concepts.
Yes. And we're also exactly. So the way that Dennett reframes it is we're not talking about sort of, the sort of hard mechanicalistic determinism. We're talking about moral agency. We're talking about the capacity for one to make decisions which are consistent with being good to oneself and to others. That is the goal. And what Dennett talks about is this idea of degrees of freedom. So a human has a greater degree of freedom than say a chimpanzee, and the chimpanzee has more agency, has more freedom than a dog, and a dog has more freedom than a bug. And what he means by that is it's the certain level of control. So he uses this example in his book Elbow Room, which is the reason that it's called Elbow Room, of a pilot flying a plane, and the controls are pretty much fixed. The destination is fixed. The altitude is fixed. All these different things are fixed. But within that, you have a certain ability of control. And in that, you have what Dennett calls elbow room, that you have this little space in between what you know to be true in the present condition and what may come in the future, where you have a certain level of control over what happens. That doesn't mean that, that the world isn't in some respects determined. It just means that humans have a certain degree of control and deliberative possibilities with relation to actions, and particularly moral actions.
So maybe another way to talk about this, if we stay within we're talking about concepts and not reality in itself.
Yeah.
Is that it's true we all have the ability to run, but a sprinter is going to do it better.
Yes.
Somebody who has the capability, a bigger vocabulary than another person, is going to have more possibilities for different kinds of thoughts and different kinds of actions than a 3-year-old, for instance.
Yep, that's exactly right.
So I think a lot of the import of Dennett's argument gets its thrust from the linguistic aspect.
Yes.
So just to use a pilot example like you used, it's true that the automatic co-pilot sort of does most of the flying.
Mm-hmm.
But if somebody who wasn't a pilot tried to land the plane, there was a study on this, like it was like almost a certainty that they would crash.
Mm-hmm.
So even when there is sort of a co-pilot in terms of reality in itself, it's also true that language is sort of like a tool whereby we can manipulate the co-pilot in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that's another way of sort of conceptualizing it.
Certainly, and I think the other thing that happens too is that when people who are hard determinists, when they often use some of the phrases that they use, whether it's the puppet master or the sort of infinite God character. What I find about determinism is that I think our hard determinism that is so interesting to me is that it's almost theological in its concept, in the sense that everything is out of your control. You have no possibility of control. You have no possibility of actually making any real decision making. It doesn't matter, because it's just going to happen as it's going to happen. And I feel like it's almost akin to saying, like, God works in mysterious ways. God's going to do what he's going to do. Like, the world's going to be as it's going to be. And I find that to be so ridiculous, because we know on some fundamental level that we do have a certain level of control based on what we know. So, for example, you use the sprinter example, right? A person who is trained in being an Olympic sprinter, somebody like Usain Bolt. Usain Bolt's going to have a certain level of elbow room in regards to what he does on the track than me, mm-hmm. who often has trouble getting up a flight of stairs because I'm overweight. He's going to have more control over his situation than me. And there's no doubt that of course, certain part of it was determined in the sense that he worked hard to get to that place, and he worked hard to get to that place because he was sort of naturally adept at doing it. Yes, on certain level, there's stuff that we cannot control. There's a vast majority about our lives that we cannot control. But once we account for that, mm-hmm. then we can actually have the better conversation, which is, okay, we know that there's a lot that we don't have control over, but there is stuff that we do, and particularly when it comes to moral decision making.
So, if we begin with the deterministic framework, for instance,
yeah,
there's no operating concept of relevant or irrelevant, right? There are just necessary movements.
Yes.
So that's a kind of logic. And it doesn't belong, for instance, we can talk about control over there, but it makes no sense because everything's necessary. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of it's not the correct use of the word control when used with this kind of logic, the deterministic logic. Mm-hmm. So control, the concept of control has within it that distinction between relevant and irrelevant. So when we're talking about moral choices, what is assumed is that there are morally relevant factors and morally irrelevant factors, right? And that's something that you can't account for if you begin with the assumptions of determinism. You can't account for it because it makes no sense to say morally relevant or irrelevant. My point is that we have two kind of linguistic traditions that are fighting over a word, free will, whereas one more linguistic tradition has different concepts associated with free will. The other has concepts that are completely foreign to the other tradition. Mm-hmm. So I think in large part, the argument is caused by this sort of morass of concepts that we're trying to associate with the free will. Mm-hmm. And I think if we become clear about what our assumptions are and about what situation we really have in mind when we're talking about free will, then I think things will sort of open up a little better. Because, for instance, if we begin with the deterministic framework, we're not thinking from the experience of a person who's in a moral situation. We're thinking of this world without humans, right? Where experience meaning, value, etc., aren't operative conditions or concepts by which we navigate the world. So the perspective from which we reflect is going to in large part determine the conclusions we have. And so the thing I think determinism doesn't have going for it is that it doesn't think from the perspective from which free will is actually an operative concept.
Exactly. And that's exactly Dennett's point too, that that's why he calls it the varieties of free will worth wanting. This is why his view of this is such a radical departure, because he's basically saying like, yeah, the concept that you think of as free will, yeah, we probably don't have that. Matter of fact, we almost certainly don't have that.
We never claimed we did, because the cause and effect continuum that science sort of works with wasn't operative as a conceptual framework when we derived the notion of free will in the first place. Exactly.
And so what Dennett's hinting at is that we can sort of conceptually establish a way of having free will that is in itself compatible with a deterministic, naturalistic, materialistic world. He uses this example in the podcast that Sam Harris did with him last year. He's a sailor. He lives out, I think, in the East Coast, and he said, "Look, I'm a sailor, right? Now I can't control the wind. I can't control the waves. I can't control the temperature outside, but I can control the steering. I can control the sails. I can control my actions in relationship to the conditions." That's what it means to have control. That's what it means to have freedom. It's a freedom that's rooted in decision making. And he uses this. He also uses this other example of when a person who's playing golf and they tee off, right? And you'll often notice he'll say things like, when you watch them, they don't often move. They don't look up after they've hit the thing, because they don't have to. There's no need to. And he constantly says, like, we can over deliberate until the cows come home, but at some point you have to hit the ball. Like you can do it so many different ways, but at some point you just have to hit it. But that's still you. And that's the thing about Harris that's so interesting to me, because he's such a vocal critic of Islam and talks about how we need to reform Islam, we need to reform its ideas, so that, because ideas have consequences and intentions matter. But then he makes a full argument in a book saying, like, none of those really do matter. The actions are going to be what they are going to be. So why don't we just reform our world to sort of deal with the actions as they are? The agents really don't matter all that much. This has been a contradiction that sits at the heart of what Harris does. And maybe it's not a contradiction. I just see it as one, because I think he is trying to reconceptualize morality from the focal point of it being agents and the focal point to being actions. But in doing that, he's undermining his whole entire other project when he's talking about Islamism and talking about fighting extremism abroad. Because if you really want to go through the implications of what you're saying, which is that all I really care about is the actions, then it doesn't matter. They could be the most liberal, tolerant, open Muslim possible, or they could be a radical jihadist who's part of ISIS. In that distinction, those belief systems are just completely interchangeable. All that matters is the action at the end. But that defeats the whole process of trying to make to make Islam less problematic to certain portions of the world in regards to terrorism. That's what's always just been a frustrating point. That I and maybe I'm wrong, but this is something about Harris's ideas about free will that just drives me crazy.
So maybe before we move to that, just to re-emphasize, when you were using the examples that Dennett provided, for instance, I think what you were doing was saying these are the frameworks in which using free will makes sense. And we have to account for what we mean by free will in these situations if we want to talk about if there really is a free will or not. we can't just start from this deterministic picture, which was never relevant.
It's not relevant because it's the given.
Right.
Dennett has it as a given. This is the given. I'm fine with all that.
Yep. So that's one of the problems I think Harris hasn't bridged. For instance, one of the very illuminating examples for me that Dennett uses is in terms of the push and pull of these concepts we use. Companies sell color TVs, right? But if we start from the scientific standpoint, we can say, actually, TVs don't contain color. It's the light reflection, right? So can somebody go in to a courthouse and sue the company for selling color TVs when in fact they don't have color, right? Are they lying to us? No, there are different notions of color in operation in science and in the corporate world where color TVs make sense to talk about. So what philosophy does is it pays attention to the situations in which the words are used and make sense. And I think because Dennett is such a great philosopher, he points out the fact that no, the notion of free will actually makes sense and it's used in these contexts, and the way you're using it in your context doesn't account for these other ways in which it's used in terms of moral responsibility and the moral framework and things.
Exactly. I love the example of the color TV because he uses another example similar to that in his conversation with Harris, where he says, when I buy a house and the realtor says, are you signing this of your own free will?
Yes.
And Dennett goes, well, of course I am. Because in that context, that makes total sense.
Well, here we go. Sam Harris needs to talk about that notion of free will. If he's going to say we don't have free will, he needs to say in what sense does talking about of your own free will, does that not make sense?
Exactly.
Right?
And that's been my notion, because if you take what Harris is saying on face value, I totally agree with him. We live in a determined world in many, many ways. Like, we don't have this sort of libertarian free will. We don't have that. But within the sort of the
everyday world.
Yeah. Within the mechanics of living life,
yep.
We do have a certain level of freedom.
Because concepts have meaning.
Absolutely. And so when Harris criticized Dennett's ideas on free will, is what he called, it had the smell of theology. Well, it's not really the smell of theology. It's the consideration of philosophy. It's the consideration of the fact that language is imprecise.
Yep.
And so that's I think the thing. It's because sometimes you can listen to two of those guys talk about this, and you can clearly tell that one doesn't really get where the other one's coming from. Mm-hmm. And it's not an insult to Harris. I just don't think Harris fully grasps exactly what Dennett's saying, but Dennett gets exactly what Harris is saying.
Yeah.
And so but I always go back to what Matt Dillahunty said, which was funny, where because he's been doing a lot of speaking dates with Harris, so you and I are going to go to one. And he goes, it's my job to sort of show you that you are a compatibilist. You just don't know it yet. And so I think on some level that's, I'd like to see Harris change his mind, because I think that in presenting that, like I said earlier, in presenting that way of free will, he's undermining a completely other big project of his own, which is to criticize what he sees as bad ideas, and in seeking to reform those ideas so as to have people make better decisions about their lives.
So I think that is correct, but I think there's a sense in which Sam Harris can still do that.
Okay.
And I think his project, and I've talked with you a little bit about this before, is very similar to what B.F. Skinner was trying to do in Beyond Freedom and Dignity. It's to shift the conversation from this existential standpoint to the conditioners of reality, which make it more likely for me to say or act a certain way. So Skinner thinks, for instance, that by the very fact that we have a literature of freedom, and that this literature of freedom is always so suspicious of being controlled by the government, for instance, us being controlled by bureaucracy. The literature itself has made us suspicious of bureaucracy, but it hasn't given us sort of a robust notion of freedom like Ayn Rand sort of talks about with morality. in which we can make sense of ourselves as free actors outside of our relationship to the bureaucratic institutions. So another way to say this is that by the very ways in which we write our literatures and talk about these concepts, we're conditioned in different ways to think about ourselves and act in the world in very specific ways, right? So Ayn Rand's thing about morality, from what I read, was that because of collectivism, we don't have a robust concept of ourselves as moral agents in situations where we're just pursuing our own goals and we don't affect anyone else. So that for collectivism, for people who think within the collectivist framework, if I'm not sacrificing myself for other people, I'm not really a moral agent.
Yes.
But Ayn Rand's whole thing is that we need to think about morality in a situation where I don't have to sacrifice myself for you and you don't have to sacrifice yourself for me, but I can still be a moral agent.
Exactly.
So right. Thinking about the effects of language as a conditioner, I think that's kind of what Sam Harris is trying to do when he critiques ideologies. So these are objective literatures.
I see. So
you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So when we're sort of, these are, like as you say, they're objective literatures, right? So in the critique of Islam and in critiquing Islamism, right, what he's trying to do is sort of, how do you say this? Like reshuffle the moral deck, as you will, or sort of reset the board and say, those moves you were making before, you can't make those moves now.
Yes. And he's sort of maybe even providing a different board on which to play.
Exactly.
So where before, for instance, if Ayn Rand never came around, and our world was just completely collectivist, it wouldn't make sense for us to think about ourselves as moral agents unless I sacrifice myself for another person, right? So when Ayn Rand comes around, there's a new possibility for action, a new understanding of meaning.
Which is what makes objectivism so radical. It's so radical because and she goes against 2,000 years of traditional ethical notions.
Yeah, I think that's what Harris is trying to do. He's trying to expand the objective linguistic framework when he's critiquing these ideologies. And, for instance, putting in place different conditioners that reinforce different kinds of actions and different kinds of thinking.
Yeah, and see, that's the thing about, I think, with Rand that's important too, is that she, like Harris, is resetting the deck, but we're resetting the game, but she's doing it in a completely different way. So, and this is a crucial thing about Rand. I think, because I wrote about her view of free will in undergrad and I compared it to Sartre. Because I actually do think that Rand is actually a bit of a compatibilist. I don't know if she'd ever claim that, but I think she was. Where she talks about the idea of freedom being volitional, where she says something along the lines of, you can choose not to decide, but you cannot escape the necessity of choice. And so she's actively saying, like, yeah, there are certain things you're not going to have control over.
So, just to interject for a second.
Yeah.
Every definition we give like that is a new kind of literature, a new kind of way of expounding our actions and creating new worlds. So
yeah, exactly. Which is why if you read like The Fountainhead or you read Atlas Shrugged, for the traditional reader who's sitting at that and reading them, they would look at that and be appalled. I mean, because it is not the traditional notions of morality. But she is completely establishing a brand new world. I mean, she's basically rewriting the human condition.
Hannah Arendt says, yesterday's radicals are today's conservatives. Because the radicals implement or project or offer new ways of looking and thinking and living, and the world sort of picks it up as time goes on.
Yep, and the implications of that are important because Rand has a very similar quote where she says, "Show me a society's dominant philosophy, and I'll show you its future." And that's very important, I think, in discussing her, which is why if you go on the internet and whatever, every other Salon.com article, they'll be like, "Oh, she's just a bitch," and fair enough, whatever. But you have to look at it within the context of what she's trying to do, which is that she is radically reshifting the moral agent from being the social sphere to the independent sphere, to the individual. So when people criticize her work, and there's a video out that I think that Corey Johnston and I talked about it on a episode or two ago, individualism versus individuality. And the video, I think, is a guy named Peter Coffin, and he has some, I think, fairly solid criticisms of Rand, which I think are important, but I think there's one crucial thing that he didn't get, which is this idea that he says something along the lines of like, Rand's version of individualism is basically a fuck you, I've got mine. I don't really give a shit about you. That's not true. What she's arguing, and there's a portion of the John Galt speech in Atlas Shrugged where she talks about there's a difference between benevolence and altruism. Benevolence is the process by which I, as a free independent agent, choose to do good for others, that it's my choice to do good for others. Now, you can disagree with that. That's fair. That, it shouldn't be a choice. You should just do the right thing. But she's making an active statement of saying, like, I do things for others because I seek to do them. Whereas altruism says that you have to do those things because society expects them of you. And that's a completely reshifting of the burden. So it goes away from being about you and it just goes about being society. Now, the implications of that are pretty radical. And if you were to sort of take Rand's philosophy and try to, and I think this is where people misunderstand her, if you try to take her world, her systematic philosophy, and just sort of plop it onto reality as we understand it, it doesn't really work, right? But if you reset the fundamentals and you sort of, if you...
The moral framework.
Yeah, if you reset the moral framework, if you do a hard reboot on it, and you set it on an objectivist ethic, it could probably work. But you have to do that.
When you say that, just to tie it to something earlier, I think you're talking about different ways in which to sort of direct the moral instinct. The definitions of morality and concepts we use to explicate it give us different avenues to direct our moral instinct. So a person who has been indoctrinated with altruism might feel themselves to be a fully robust moral agent, even though for Ayn Rand there would be an emptiness for them when they're not sacrificing themselves. There would be a moral emptiness. But I think there's a sense in which that's not true for the one truly indoctrinated with altruism. This sort of gets back to the is-ought problem. The is-ought problem, I think, is something derived from the scientific assumptions and framework about reality. Everything's necessary in the cause and effect continuum, and so the notion of is-ought collapses in the scientific. But when the scientific sort of examines conceptual frameworks like moral frameworks, I think it can also cause an is-ought distinction, because it imposes, here's the basic information about your situation when you make a decision. So it can give you facts, right? And then it tries to think about, well, what makes you choose this over that? Where's the ought? There's no ought to be found, right? So the is-ought both collapses within the scientific, but it's also created by the scientific framework.
Yeah. And the thing about, that notion is it goes back to Rand's philosophy. I mean, objectivism gives people a certain level of agency that they don't have in a classical framework of sort of ethical society. If you look at altruism as a whole, it just sort of assumes as at the given, there are certain givens about it in terms of action. Whereas Rand's philosophy consciously makes a point of saying
there are no givens.
There are no givens. The only thing that's given to you is existence. Existence is the given. Consciousness is the given. Everything else is volitional. And so you have to actively be a moral agent. You can't be a passive one. In an altruistic society, you can be a passive moral agent, where you can just do right because it's right and whatever. In objectivism, no, you have to be a conscious agent of your own life, and in order to make moral decisions. That's the key there is, and that's where I find when people say that, oh, her life, her view of the world will lead to a sort of a fuck you, I got mine. Maybe that's the case, in the sense that maybe that's the end. Maybe there's a flaw in what she's trying to get across. But at the same time, and maybe this leads to the fact that a lot of people think that objectivism can be rather culty, which I think it can be. There's people who are sort of orthodox objectivists, people like Leonard Peikoff, who is his intellectual heir. But then you have like what I would call neo-objectivists, people like David Kelly, who are sort of like, okay, these are all great ideas. How do we actually implement them? How do we actually make them actionable? How can we really apply what we're trying to do in the real world? Which is why you have the split between, say, like, there's like Ayn Rand Institute objectivists, and then there's, Atlas Society objectivists. Anyway, and in that regard, it's very religious.
So in reading Ayn Rand, I sort of have had a critique of her conception of morality in this sense. I could understand myself to not be sacrificing myself for others or sacrificing others for myself, but that not be true. So does just consciously thinking I'm not sacrificing myself for others for these aims make it true? Or what makes that true? So for instance, I think it's nearly impossible for us as Americans to escape the fact that anything we do exacerbates the problem of global warming, which exacerbates the worst effects it has on the most marginalized populations in the world, right? Mm-hmm. There's a sense in which I'm not sure if anything I do won't sacrifice other people, right?
That's true, and that's the thing, right? So like when Rand says something like, I swear by my life and my love of it that I will not live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for the sake of mine. Mm-hmm. When she says something like that, like that's an active process. I'm not living for you, actively not living for you, and you are not actively living for me, right? But there are ancillary effects of your actions that you can't control.
Exactly.
And this goes back to compatibilism in the sense that there's a lot you have control over, there's a lot you don't have control over. And the implications of some of the things that you do will affect other people, whether you actively chose to do that or not. Mm-hmm. That is a problem for her philosophy. It just is. Because it assumes that what you do is sort of in a vacuum.
Yeah, it's a hyper-individualism.
And that's where it does have a lot of problems, which is why I think what I think is important to take away from her ideas, particularly, I think that her strongest contribution to philosophy was epistemology and the theory of knowledge. That's where I think she excelled. I think some of the other stuff doesn't always work. But again, she's one of the last modern philosophers to create a systematic philosophy. Most philosophers don't do that anymore. Most of them have like a certain thing that they focus on, whether it's philosophy of mind or philosophy of linguistics or ethics or whatever. But she was like, no, I'm creating an entire system. And so, but anyway, my point is that there are going to be things you just can't control. And does that lead you to do things that are altruistic? Like, say, for example, you are a businessman and you want to make steel. I'll use the Atlas Shrugged example. You're Henry Reardon and you want to make Reardon steel or Reardon metal. And you set up your plant and everything's going great. You're making money or whatever. But you just so happen to be by a river and the runoff from your plant is going into this river. And it's contaminating a local water supply for farmers. Your active decision to make money and be a businessman has indirectly harmed another person's ability to have a life and be a farmer and live their own lives. Mm-hmm. And by inadvertently harming their way of life, you are actually asking them to live for the sake of you.
Yeah.
This is where government's important. In the sense that like that's why you need, this is where like your sort of laissez-faire thing actually kind of falls apart, because if you actually think out the implications of what she's saying, you actually have to say, no. You actually kind of do need government. You need regulations. You need you need an EPA to say, hey, you can't dump your runoff into the river because you're harming the commons. And and I've heard objectivists make the argument of something along the lines of like, oh, well, we would set up like a private institution that would arbitrate disputes and things like that. And I'm saying, well, what's the difference between that and government? Nothing.
Except it would be undemocratic.
Exactly.
Sounds like.
Exactly. Which is a huge critique of libertarianism. And it's a huge critique of Rand in the sense that and again, this goes back to this idea that the implications of a person's actions have ripple effects. Mm-hmm. They affect things, whether you like it or not. And by actively making your own decisions, and I'm not saying in my example that Henry Reardon did it maliciously. I'm not saying that.
Right.
What I'm saying is, I have runoff. Mm-hmm. Here's a river nearby. I don't think anybody lives close. I don't think it feeds in anything. I can do this. But then you turn out, oh no, you actually are harming something. So
yeah, the intent doesn't have to be malicious for the consequence to be harmful. Exactly.
And this goes back to where it's interesting, where Rand's total philosophy is actually in some respects can be critiqued by another libertarian thinker named F.A. Hayek, who makes this point of what he calls the knowledge problem. And it's this fundamental part of sort of Austrian economics and libertarian thinking where we are all agents with imperfect knowledge. And the point of economics, the whole point of a society is for people to actively use their knowledge with one another to create solutions. So there's stuff that you know about the world that is efficacious to you and likewise for me. And that we exchange with each other voluntarily because we lack knowledge of each other. That's, whereas with Rand's system, like she's assuming that everybody's kind of like a god. They're sort of hyper-rational, hyper-omnipotent. And that's just not human beings. Human beings are imperfect like that. And again, this is why I'm not an objectivist. I'm somebody who's influenced by Rand, but I'm not an objectivist or libertarian, is that the implications of what you're actually advocating for don't actually get you what you want. Mm-hmm. Like that. And that's I think that's a huge problem.
So to connect this back to the Dennett and Harris debate,
you're killing it on the segues, by the way. You're doing real good.
that we can't control the consequences of our actions, for instance. I told you about this Thomas Nagel essay on moral luck, which is fascinating to me. Moral luck is basically when we're judged morally for something we didn't really have responsibility for the outcome of. So, for instance, if I'm drunk driving and I swerve off the road and I just hit a tree, I'm going to be judged less morally harshly than if I'm drunk driving, I swerve off the road, and there just happens to be a person there, and I hit them on my way to the tree. Right? I can't control whether that person's there or not. That's just the situation in which I happen to swerve off the road because I'm drunk, right? But in one situation, I'm judged more harshly than the other as a person, because the consequences of my actions are sort of greater in one instance than the other. I affect more people. So Nagel's argument is that there's a sense in which, from one level of analysis, I can't control the outcome of any of my actions. No matter my moral intent, there can always be harmful consequences. So there's a sense in which this notion of control undermines morality, which can be Sam Harris's argument. Right?
Yeah.
So there's an interesting way in which Sam Harris might have a point after all.
True. And that the means don't really matter all that much. It's really only about the ends.
Right.
And that in order to make a better society, we reframe it so that the ends are a little better.
So that we can have conditioners which would like with Skinner, which would more likely give us certain outcomes over others.
Yeah, no, that's true. Well, and the thing that's so interesting, I'm so glad you brought up Nagel and moral luck, because Dennett talks about that in Elbow Room, and he talks about how it's most important in terms of luck and how luck plays into everyday lives. So he talks about it and frames it in this very concise way. He says that we all deal with a certain level of luck or unluck, but that doesn't make us unlucky people.
So Dennett's point is there, I think, is basically a double down on this idea that we have to think from within situations where morality, free will makes sense to talk about in the first place.
Absolutely.
So what Nagel's doing is imposing the luck concept as central to morality, whereas it's not. Because within morality, we have relevant and irrelevant factors in making a moral decision. Right? So, yeah, I think that's a good point.
Exactly. So when somebody says, oh, I'm just an unlucky person. Well, no, you're not.
Right.
No one is an unlucky person, but we all deal with unlucky things that happen to us or things that are a part of our lives. And that's because I think that saying I'm an unlucky person is granting luck an agency I don't think it has.
Well,
and by doing that, you actually undermine the concept of luck in and of itself. If you say that I'm an unlucky person, then what you're actually saying is that I'm determined to do bad, which isn't really luck at all. Like that's really the trouble.
Maybe the stronger point is you don't know how to use the word luck.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. I think that luck is not predicated on agents. I think that luck is predicated on situations. I think that, so for example, if I'm stuck in like a shitty traffic jam, right, and I can't get through the light, I'm fucking mad. Yep. And I may personally feel like I'm unlucky.
Yeah, because of that. Right.
And we all do this, right?
Yeah.
Even though it's completely irrational, it's totally like just bullshit. But we'll all sit there and we'll be like, man, this fucking sucks. Why does shit happen to me today?
Yeah.
But it didn't happen to you. It just happened. And you're just a part of that happening. This is where there is a portion of the world that is just truly determined that you don't have control over. I could drop dead tomorrow. I don't have control over that. That's where, yes, unluck does exist, but unlucky people do not. And the same with luck, right? You can have a certain level of luck, but there's no such thing as a lucky person.
Right.
Because you could do a thing where you're sort of, I don't know, where if you say you're a lucky person, right? Like a gambler who's lucky or whatever. Well, okay, how really lucky are you? If you are hitting the right number on roulette 5 times out of 10 and you're not hitting it 5 times out of 10, you're an equal amount of lucky or unlucky. But you could just call yourself lucky and discount what's unlucky.
Right.
And that is
perspectival.
Yeah, exactly. That's dismissing the misses and counting and exaggerating the hits, which is what psychics do. They do the same thing with the process of cold reading. You can throw out a bunch of stuff that doesn't mean anything, but the stuff that does mean something is meaningful to people.
Yeah.
And they'll remember that. Luck works the same way. We all deal with a certain level of luck and unluck in our lives. It's part of just life. But to say that you're a lucky person or an unlucky person is meaningless.
So what you're doing there, I think, is establishing the grammar of luck. His relationship with other concepts.
Absolutely. And that's what Dennett does.
Yes.
I mean, he's reconceptualizing it in the sense that
well, I'm not sure he's so much as reconceptualizing it as calling to our attention the correct use of the word, the correct grammar.
He's specifying it.
Yes.
Like he's clarifying it.
That's right.
And saying this is really how luck works.
So in the debate with Harris, I think what Dennett's trying to do is clarify the grammar of free will. Whereas Harris thinks they're having a conversation about what corresponds to reality.
Yes.
And in some ways, what Harris's project is, I think, is sort of coherent and legitimate in that he's trying to set the right conditioners for better society, for sort of move if you think about, well, it's an expanding of the horizon where it improves the probability of good actions and decreases the probability of bad actions.
Exactly. The way I would frame it is that Harris looks at morality like an equation, and Dennett looks at it as if it's a novel. And so what I mean by that is that Harris is sort of going, okay, well, if I change this variable here, and if I change this number here, yes, I'll get this.
Yep.
Whereas Dennett's saying, okay, here's my setting, here's my characters. Mm-hmm. I may not fully know what the plot is, but we'll figure that out as we go. Mm-hmm. And it will be dependent upon what the characters do. And this is, and again, this goes to show you like the fundamental difference, because you have both men who are obsessed and I think very erudite about the philosophy of mind, but they're looking at it two different ways.
One's science, the other is basically humanities.
Yep. One is neuroscientific, the other one is linguistic. Mm-hmm. And that is where I think it's so important to hit at, is that notion of the fact that Harris's notion is, okay, if we tweak this and we tweak that, then we've got it. But what Dennett's trying to say is like, we're never going to have that. We're never going to have the equation is the basis of what your equation is going to be. You're never going to have that information. You're only going to have as much as what's allowed to you, which is that you're going to have the fact that you are a living being. You're going to have the fact that you live in a situation. You're going to have a fact. You're going to have to make a certain level of decisions based on what happens to you.
There's an extent to which, though, I think Harris's point is kind of true in the sense that whereas a first grader can work with an equation of free will where mm-hmm. 1 + 1 = 2, mm-hmm. a college graduate can work with, differential calculus.
Equations, yeah. And I think the other thing is too, and this is also where Dennett and Harris may be talking past each other, is that Harris is looking at this at the macro level in sort of a big picture space.
Say the world without humans.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And Dennett is looking at it in the micro level, where he's like, okay, from experience and from an individual's relationship to the world. Mm-hmm.
It's the existential versus objectivist split, basically.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And the problem that I have with Harris's view of it is I think that it requires a certain level of omniscience that we do not have.
Yeah, maybe supercomputers will.
Maybe supercomputers will do it. I mean, he's way more worried about AI than I am. But he's way more versed in it. I need to read Nick Bostrom's book, because he's always talked about the book Superintelligence. But I think we'll finish up. Tyler, this has been great, man.
Yeah,
it's been a fantastic conversation. I really have appreciated it. Thank you for coming all the way here to be in person. It's really nice, and thanks again for your help yesterday. So we're trying out a new recording system so that the audio will be a little better for you guys. You can catch us on SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, and now Google Play. My friend Mike, who has a podcast of his own, I forget what it's called. I think it's like the Ashen Bone Diaries or the Ashen Bone Logs. If you look up Ashen Bone on Twitter, you'll find him. Go check out his podcast. It's all about gaming and fun stuff like that. I think he's a real good guy, and I think he needs to have listeners too. And he suggested we get on Google Play, so that's how we made that happen. Please check out our website, reasonrevolution.org. You can find all the episodes there, as well as additional content. Once I finally get Elbow Room finished, I'll be writing a review of Elbow Room. I'm also working on an essay about the radical atheism of Emma Goldman, the anarchist philosopher. And what else? Facebook, please. We're nearly to 600 likes on Facebook, which is pretty cool. Facebook.com/ReasonRevolution. You can also find the links to our podcasts and see some of our cool memes there as well, and links to other relevant content. As always, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and YouTube at The Daily Clark. We also have a Twitter now for the show, Reason Revolution Pod. Tyler, do you have any you want to tell them your Twitter handle?
Or I don't remember it actually, but I'm in light of the theological reflections I've had recently. I'm also going to be writing for Christianity Now.
Great.
On the distinction between sin and godlessness, and how godlessness is more essential to theology than sin as merely moral. Yeah, and just trying to work out consequences for secularism as a humanism. So yeah, you can find me there as well.
Fantastic.
I'll be writing for the website too sometimes.
Wonderful. That's great. Until next week, this has been Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.